The first time the VR collective saw Earth, their decision was unanimous. No contact, no compromise, primitives. A species still tied to a single planet, bound by atmosphere and gravity, limited in spectrum, locked in tribal conflict. They watched the broadcasts bleed from Earth's ionosphere and labeled it cultural static. War after war, the plagues, the fractured governance, the nuclear flirtations, they observed it all with a mixture of pity and disdain. But it was not fear that kept the VR away, it was disappointment. They had long ago cultivated a philosophy that the emotional volatility of lesser races would only poison the intricate balance they'd spent eons curating across the galactic sectors. So when the human delegation arrived uninvited, a single jury-rigged warp tunnel away from obliteration, the VR ambassador demanded their immediate removal. "This council does not negotiate with entropy and flesh," came the translated resonance of diplomat Chorus Vector, his three throats harmonizing into judgment. His form pulsed with faint luminescence under the crystalline curvature of the Galactic Council chamber. General Elira Mendez of Earth stood tall, her uniform still bearing the blackened scars of the last orbital battle above Ganymede. Her voice was calm, but beneath it throbbed a temper forged in the crucible of humanity's near extinction. "You don't know us," she said, "but you will." No deal was struck, no alliance born. The humans returned to their fringe sector, to the shattered remnants of the Martian lattice fleet, to orbital platforms running on salvaged cores. But they didn't stop building, they never stopped building. In the years that followed, the VR moved on, ignoring the flickering human reports clawing their way through the outer relay networks. The Council would occasionally mention the Earth anomaly, but most had already consigned the species to a footnote in galactic archives, until the siege of Balcoran. It began with the Arathan swarm, a migratory semi-sentient biotech species driven mad by the decay of their birthing moons. They'd consumed 3 civilizations in 7 cycles, leaving only vacuum behind. When their vessels descended upon the vital core world Balcoran, the VR responded with calculated delay. Aid fleets arrived only after the planet's atmospheric membranes were breached. Billions died, the swarm moved on. What remained was a council scandal and political fracturing among the VR client races. Into that vacuum, figurative and literal, stepped the humans again, not with ships of glory, but with converted mining cruisers packed to their hulls with refugee processing centers and sterilization drones. They called it Operation Ashen Light. The VR watched with muted interest as humans crossed gulfs of space to rescue species that had never acknowledged their existence. Crews ran missions with ancient engines and makeshift plasma rigs. Half their ships burned in re-entry or shattered in atmosphere. But one survived every landing. The CNS Lancer, commanded by Captain Vira Halden. The Lancer was old, older than the war on Ganymede, older than even the first lunar colony revolt. Its plating was patchwork. Its AI had suffered multiple core resets, but it was fast, reckless, and wherever it went, miracles seemed to follow. They rescued the gas breathers of the Tyrellan depths by flying through an acidic jet stream no sane navigator would have approached. They triggered seismic detonations on a decaying asteroid to lift buried survivors into low orbit. They did what logic forbade. And so the name Halden started to reach ears beyond Saul. She was never present at diplomatic events, never one for protocol, but stories emerged. How she held off a swarm dreadnought with only pulse mines and orbital debris. How she stood against a rogue AI fleet and convinced it to stand down using only memory cores of lost human children. The VR ignored the stories. Mythos was the opiate of dying species. But then came the Nalthai's debrief. Deep within the archives of the VR central dataspire, encrypted under a dozen layers of silence orders, a report flickered to life. A minor official had compiled it, cross-referencing dozens of human fleet interactions, planetary data, and untraceable distress signals. There was a pattern. Where Halden appeared, the probability models, those sacred calculations the VR trusted more than faith, collapsed, predictions failed, causality bent, systems meant to simulate trillions of outcomes couldn't account for her decisions. And then she died. Officially. During the 5th extraction mission on Zurich 4, a volatile moon undergoing quantum phase destabilization, the Lancer's final message was a data burst fragment, engaging field with fallback protocol. For all we've saved, all we couldn't. That should have been the end. But weeks later, a diplomatic vessel carrying survivors from Zurich 4 was intercepted near the Relian Drift. On board were wounded from over 7 species, including a Tyrolean counselor, one who hadn't been recorded as even present during the moon's collapse. And deep in the vessel's core matrix was a human. Captain Vira Halden. Alive. Barely. No life support, no functioning med unit. She'd been exposed to radiation levels lethal within minutes. Neurological decay, organ failure, a walking corpse. Yet she moved. Breathed. Spoke. I told you, she rasped through half-burned lungs, we don't stop. The council demanded her medical logs. They found nothing but inconsistencies. Systems that should have failed didn't. Cells that should have necrotized resisted decay. No known stimulant, gene mod, or technology accounted for her condition. But one alien among the council took notice. Of the Vrarthal, son of the crystalline lineage, tactical ascendant of the 14th Doctrine Fleet, he had once argued most fiercely against human integration. He now petitioned to meet Captain Halden in person. His request was denied. So he went rogue. He broke protocol, shattered the ancient neutrality of the Doctrine Fleet, and descended alone upon the human orbital facility orbiting Titan's largest moon. What he found was not a warrior triumphant. He found a woman dying, but still walking, still commanding. The moment he entered the cold medbay, her eyes met his. They were clouded with blood and cracked iris membrane, but still held clarity, still burned. I know you, she said. You're the one who called us entropy and flesh. I did, Esraelith said, his voice modulated through resonance harmonics. I no longer believe that. She coughed, a spray of blood catching in the recycled air. What changed? You should be dead. Her smile was thin and cruel. Yeah, I get that a lot. Esraelith leaned closer, observing the layers of necrosis resisting collapse, not stalling, resisting, a feedback loop of sheer neurological will preventing final cessation. You remain animate not through technology or medicine, he said slowly, but something else, a fuel unknown to our doctrines. She said nothing, but her expression said everything. Despite, she wasn't alive for glory. She wasn't alive to be remembered. She was alive because she refused not to be. That day Esraelith bent the knee, not out of defeat but revelation. He returned to the council and cast the deciding vote that ended 500 years of isolation policy. The humans were brought into the fold, but not as subordinates, as catalysts, because the galaxy had never seen a species that could bend death through rage alone. But this was only the beginning. And Halden was not yet done. The protocols shattered by Esraelith's defection sent tremors through the Galactic Accord's foundations. The Vrarthal did not react with rage, they did not possess such a base emotion. Instead, their response was more ominous, silence, a stillness of the kind that heralded change or judgment. Within 3 solar rotations of Esraelith's testimony, the Doctrine Fleet was withdrawn from 27 neutral systems. Observation posts went dark. Key diplomatic relays in the Vrarthal deepweb turned inward, obfuscated. The last time such a quieting occurred, an entire star cluster had vanished under directive quarantine. The galaxy braced for another purge. But the Vrarthal did not move to erase the humans. They did something far more dangerous. They began to watch. Humanity had never been ready for the weight of galactic attention, but they had already survived worse: extinction-level climate spirals, orbital bombardments from rogue AI collectives, internal schisms that tore Earth's nations apart and reforged them under necessity, not idealism. So they did what they always did when the world watched with cold judgment. They adapted. At the edge of known space, a new outpost rose. It was Vrarthal, it was human, it was something new. Nexus V, the Null Bastion. Constructed from human orbital frameworks and enhanced with crystalline Vrarthal lattice cores, it was both a fortress and a proving ground. Here, for the first time, mixed species crews would train under human command, not out of charity, but because the Doctrine Council needed to understand what Esraelith had seen in Halden and what might come of it. Captain Halden was not present. Her condition had worsened after the Titan incident. The medical teams, both human and alien, had given her 2 weeks at best. She outlived them, and then disappeared. No shuttle launch, no security breach. The medbay was found empty during a routine systems diagnostic. Her biosigns ended at a blind spot in the facility's scanner net, one that should not have existed. Command assumed she had finally succumbed and been vaporized during an auto-purge malfunction, but Esraelith believed otherwise. He said nothing, but deep in the resonance chambers of his lineage temple, he began composing a new doctrine. One that had no name. Not yet. Meanwhile, Nexus V became the crucible. The first mixed squadron formed was designated Unit 9X, though its members quickly took to calling themselves Dead Signal, in reference to the black broadcast zone Earth's early colonies had once used to hide from predatory fleets. The unit was led by Commander Juno Baird, Haldan's former XO. Unlike Haldan, Baird had no flair for martyrdom. She was precise, cold, and efficient. A former orbital drop tactician, she believed in chain of command and algorithmic warfare, but she also believed in results, and humans got them. Her squadron included Threxelin, a VR Rarthal memory engineer, whose species had never served under an alien command until now. Kelvarn, a human orbital commando who'd survived being spaced in a failed boarding op and re-entered his destroyed ship by blowing the side open with shaped charges and threading the vacuum barehanded. Cian Kor, a Jastari glide shifter, whose people had evolved in atmospheric vortices and could navigate spatial anomalies without instrumentation. And then there was Lorna Baron. No file existed for him prior to the Ganymede collapse. He had no known rank, but he was there on every recovered recording, always near Haldan, sometimes in the background, sometimes leading extraction charges through flaming bulkheads. The man had no gene tag, no service record, no verified birthplace. And yet no one questioned his assignment. He didn't speak much, but when he did, people listened, even the VR Arthal. Dead Signal's first mission was meant to be symbolic, a low-risk operation near the Arkan Shardfields, recovering lost research cores from a derelict Jastari drift archive. The VR Arthal observers treated it as a formality. Until the V-Hect emerged. They were not part of the Accord, they were not even part of recorded galactic history. The V-Hect were something else. Encrypted records would later reveal fragments of data long buried, half-living predators bred in entropy fields near black hole accretion zones. Created by a civilization that had long since torn itself apart, leaving only its weapons behind. The V-Hect weren't invaders, they were seekers. Seekers of failure. Of species that had grown too arrogant, of technologies that reached too far, they came not to conquer but to correct. Their appearance in the Shardfields was not random. They were drawn by Dead Signal. The mission became a massacre. The Jastari glide lanes twisted violently, shredding long-range nav support. Half the human craft were disabled in minutes. The V-Hect didn't use weapons in the conventional sense. They emitted pulses of existential decay, waves that unraveled memory, made minds forget who they were, what they were doing. Crews turned on each other. Ships veered into spires of magnetic stone, their own AI units overridden by induced madness. Commander Baird managed to rally a defensive wedge, using one of the drifting archive fragments as cover. She ordered a full retreat. Lorna Baron refused. He took one gunship, the Ravelin, and disappeared into the storm. The VR Arthal observers declared the action a fatal breach of doctrine and prepared to mark him as KIA. Then 3 days later, he returned. His ship was half-atomized. The hull had fused with what appeared to be organic metal, something the V-Hect were never known to leave behind. He had no memory of the missing hours. Only scars, a network of burning filaments across his chest, like something had tried to rewrite him and failed. And with him, he brought one thing. A pod. Inside, a captured V-Hect node core, still pulsing, still awake. The first ever brought back alive. The VR Arthal convened an emergency summit. Unit 9X was labeled too dangerous to continue operating freely. Baird was promoted but reassigned. Cian Kor returned to her people. Threxelin requested binding silence and entered a deep resonance cloister. Only Lorne remained. He made no defense, simply placed the node core on the council floor and said, "They're not just enemies, they're executioners of failure, of stagnation, and they're not finished." What the council didn't know, what no one knew, was that the core was not the only thing Lorne had brought back. He had changed. Subtly, irrevocably. The scars were not healing, they were growing, shifting. And sometimes when the lights dimmed, when the grav generators flickered during system resets, voices would echo in the corridors of Nexus V. Not human, not via Rarthal. Whispers from the dark between stars. But Lorne did not fear them. He welcomed them, because he knew something no one else did. Captain Halden wasn't dead, and she wasn't just alive. She was becoming something else. Something the Vhecht feared. And the only way to reach her was to go deeper. Beyond Council space. Beyond map sectors. Into the places where death was not an end but a frontier. Lorna Baron disappeared 41 hours after the Vhecht core was delivered. There was no launch sequence, no transponder trail, no record of breach in Nexus V's perimeter. One moment he was under debrief in the defies comm vault, the next void. The Council assumed abduction, perhaps a Vhecht retrieval protocol. Others whispered of internal sabotage. But Esraelith, silent until now, issued a rare public transmission. Do not look for him, he is where he needs to be. And with that, the investigation was closed. But humanity didn't let it go. Baird, now promoted to Admiral of the 3rd Integration Fleet, diverted resources without permission. Old contacts across the Rim, pirates, rogue syntharchivists, forgotten orbital tribes were activated. They called it the Threadnet, a resurrected human intelligence network that had once helped Earth survive its civil fracture era. It moved in whispers, in songs passed between miners, in blink code flashes on asteroids too small to notice. The rumors came slowly, fragments more than facts. Lorne had been seen near Rivendine, a starless convergence point where gravitational anomalies created transit paths between systems that should not intersect. It was an old myth, a place where ships vanished and memories bled. The VRRthal had long ago banned entry, calling it a point of doctrinal corruption. But humanity had no doctrine to protect. So Baird sent a single ship. The CNS Tellurian. Crewed by veterans of Dead Signal, silent types survivors. And among them was one not listed on the manifest. Vira Halden. She had returned. Not as a commander, not even as a soldier. She wore no insignia, her body bore new scars deeper than flesh, layered in patterns that shimmered faintly in the dark. Medical scans failed to identify their nature. Psychological assessments reported non-binary consciousness layering, whatever that meant. But when she looked at her old crew, they stood straighter. Even Baird, hard-edged and pragmatic, paused before speaking in her presence. I'm not back for war, Halden told her, standing in the Tellurian's silent hangar bay, surrounded by drifting frost. Then why are you here? Baird asked. Halden stared into the distance, past steel and stars. Because he followed me into the dark, and I won't let him walk it alone. Rivendine was not a place, it was a fracture. The Tellurian crossed the event horizon, and the stars blinked out. Not dimmed. Gone. They entered a space without time where physics stuttered and causality flickered like faulty circuits. Internal clocks ceased to align, AI systems collapsed into recursion spirals. A week passed on the med deck, minutes passed on the bridge. The crew began to lose track of their own memories. But Halden remained stable. She walked through the void like one returning home. And then they found the derelict. At the center of Rivendine's impossible gravity well was a ship. No beacon, no signal, no heat signature, but its outline was unmistakable. It was the Lancer. Intact. Unpowered. Anchored in orbit around a dead nothing. Not a planet, not a moon, a hole in reality. They boarded her in silence. The inside was wrong, rooms where they shouldn't be, hallways that looped back on themselves, doors that opened onto vacuum and then, without transition, onto Earth landscapes that could not exist. A childhood street, a Martian training yard, the shattered ruins of Ganymede's defense line. The Lancer wasn't just a ship. It was becoming something else. At its core they found Lorne. His body was suspended in a lattice of living metal, some fusion of Vhecht tech and something older. His eyes were open, burning. But he did not speak. Not until Halden touched the metal. Then he screamed. The sound wasn't human, it wasn't pain. It was data compressed into sound, 14 seconds of incomprehensible syllables that triggered nosebleeds, memory loops, seizures. Only Halden stood firm. She listened. And then she spoke back. What happened next cannot be fully understood. The lattice cracked, not shattered, opened. A ripple of light spread outward and the Lancer came alive. But not with engines. With memory. It began to broadcast, not radio, not quantum, something deeper. Across space, minds heard it in dreams. Councils paused in unspoken fear. The Vhect screamed in unison across 3 sectors and withdrew from known space. And the VRR Thal, they did something they had not done in over a millennium. They prayed. The broadcast contained no words. Just a single feeling. Defiance. And from that moment, Halden and Lorne were no longer merely human, nor were they Vhect or something in between. They had become transgressive echoes, entities that embodied what the VRR doctrine had long suppressed: nonlinear resilience, rage given shape, spite rendered eternal. They returned to Nexus V not on a ship but as a phenomenon. The Lancer did not use drive systems. It folded space through will. It emerged above the station like a living scar, surrounded by pulses of refracted memory and impossible matter. The Council demanded explanation. Asrelith answered, "Your equations cannot contain them. Stop trying." He turned his voice to the chamber and delivered a single declaration. Humanity is no longer subject to our framework. They are no longer anomaly. They are variable, catalyst. They cannot be measured because they refuse to remain what they were. It was not a surrender. It was an evolution. For the VRR were not fools. They saw what was coming, what followed the Vhect. The Null Choir. Entities not born, not built, but remembered into existence by forgotten empires. They moved in waves of entropy. They consumed timelines, not species, not stars, possibilities. And they were coming. The galaxy would not survive through balance, through order, through logic. It would survive, if at all, through impossibility. Through those who defied endings. Through spite. And only one species had proven they could. Humanity. But even they would not be enough alone. So for the first time, the Council turned its eyes outward, not to judge, but to learn. The age of doctrine was ending. The age of the broken pattern had begun. And at its heart stood 2 impossibilities. Vira Halden, Lorna Baron. Dead once. Now something else. And the galaxy would never be the same. It began with the collapse of Kelt Prime. Not its cities, not its population. Its timeline. One day, the Central Archive held 8,000 years of planetary history. The next, 12 days, entire eras, dynasties, cultural epochs gone, replaced by a single looping script in dead code. All things still, all things silent. The Null Choir had arrived. They moved like dark harmonics across spacetime, not vessels, not fleets, just a presence that silenced motion, extinguished future and past alike. Their arrival wasn't marked by destruction but by absence, systems where stars no longer burned, where memory itself decayed. Against them, weapons failed, strategies unraveled. The VRR doctrine arrays, designed to predict 1 trillion combat permutations, produced only blank returns when null proximity was factored in. So they turned to the only ones untouched by that silence. The Echoes. Halden and Lorne. The Lancer became more than a vessel. It became a convergence vector, a crosspoint where reality bent, allowing travel between fragments of collapsing timelines. With each maneuver, the ship lost something of its original form. Its decks no longer obeyed architecture. Its AI, once a simple combat logic mesh, now sang, no language, just tones. Every time the Lancer returned from a fold, the humans who crewed it were changed. Some physically, some in the mind. Others simply remembered things that had not yet happened. And still they returned. Because Halden willed it. Because Lorne guided it. They began what was called the Ashbound Offensive, not a war in the traditional sense, but a sequence of recursive interventions. Each time the Choir attempted to unmake a world, the Lancer inserted itself into the timeline, not to prevent the fall, but to anchor the memory of what was. If memory could survive, so too could resistance. It became clear the Choir did not consume matter. It consumed possibility. Hope, potential, and nothing enraged it more than refusal. So humanity fed its spite. Entire fleets were built not to win but to lose with defiance. Ships launched knowing they would never return, their only purpose to scream their refusal into the Choir's face. The Choir responded. It fragmented. One of its fragments, a distortion labeled Refrain 7, appeared near the ruins of Veskar Prime and did not immediately consume the system. It circled, pulsed, as if uncertain. Halden arrived alone. She left the Lancer in geosync orbit and descended in a personal drop craft. The fragment hovered like a wound in space, dark, beautiful, unknowable. She walked into it and vanished. For 17 days, no signal emerged. Then, without warning, Refrain 7 collapsed. Not an explosion, in retreat. And with its fading came a ripple of memory shared across every intelligent mind within 5 sectors. A single image. Halden standing before a choir construct, eyes burning with something no translation matrix could categorize. Her words, unfiltered by comms, broadcast directly into consciousness, were etched into collective memory. We do not accept the end, write that into your silence. The choir began to hesitate. Not stop but slow. And in that pause, the galaxy found its breath again. Esraelith, now commander of the Unified Interstis Network, a cooperative force of species that had never before shared war doctrine, initiated Protocol Verge, a plan to transform memory into resistance. They began constructing resonance anchors, structures that encoded cultural identity, music, conflict, loss, and love into fractal echoes. These anchors, powered by emotion rather than physics, created zones where the choir's influence weakened. Human engineers worked beside crystalline VRarthal phase-smiths, beside Jastari spatial linguists, beside Tyrellin Payne scribes. Each resonance anchor was unique, each a monument to life, however flawed. And in orbit of every anchor floated a single human-built defense station. Their names were etched in steel. Halden's Fury, Memory Unbroken. Lorne's Answer. They were not beautiful, they were not sleek. They were jagged, bristling with weaponry, duct-taped with alien shielding and brute force gravity lenses. But they held. Every time. The war shifted. It was not about winning, it was about surviving long enough to tell one more story. To resist one more hour. To scream one more time into the dark. And for the first time, the choir reacted. Not in silence, but in speech. A signal emerged, no origin, no vector, just presence. It entered dreams, navigational relays, even the synthetic thought matrices of VRarthal emissaries. It did not threaten, it asked. Why do you not surrender? It was Lorne who answered. He stood on the edge of the Forjanker above Hekro's III, surrounded by weapons that could obliterate cities, looking into the swirl of choir presence bleeding across the stars. And he said, because you're not the end, you're the test. He lifted a single encoded pulse, projected it not with technology but with will. The response was felt, not heard, a shudder across realities. The choir pulled back. Not gone but uncertain. For the first time, the galaxy had tasted something stronger than logic, more lasting than power. It had tasted human refusal. Not for glory, not for legacy, but because even when all light died, they still had something left. Spite. And from spite they built miracles. The Lancer became legend, an entity, a symbol. It appeared across fractured sectors without warning, depositing survivors in impossible places, stitching broken timelines back into coherence. And always at its helm stood Halden. Not alive, not dead. Becoming. The VRarthal began rewriting doctrine. The Tyrellin depths began using human myths as navigational markers. The Jastari formed a new language structure, gravithought based on human defiance patterns. The galaxy did not become peaceful, it did not become united. But it stopped dying. And somewhere far beyond the edge of mapped space, in a darkness even the choir feared, Halden stood before a gate of absolute silence. Lorne at her side. They did not look back. Because what was behind them already knew the truth. They were not the end. They were the reason the end had not yet come. No one followed them through the gate. Even the Lancer, now more myth than ship, did not pass beyond. It held at the threshold like a sentinel unwilling to witness what lay on the other side. Inside its walls, the crew waited, half human, half something else, bearing memories of events that had never occurred in linear time. They watched their commander go where even the choir dared not linger. Halden and Lorne stepped into the unmade verge, a realm without constants, where the laws of creation had never been applied. This was the domain the null choir had been born from, the wound beneath reality where probability bled into meaninglessness. It wasn't space, it wasn't a void, it was absence, given structure only by their refusal to break. Halden's skin cracked with light. Lorne's bones rang with distant chords. They moved not through space but through resistance, the opposition of every dying star, every final breath ever exhaled in futility. They moved forward. Because there was something there. Not the choir, not death's origin. The heart of entropy, not malevolent, not sentient, just final. A sphere of perfect silence spinning slowly in the center of what might have once been a starfield. Around it circled ghosts not of people but of timelines, lives unlived, victories never won, worlds that never rose. Lorne reached out and recoiled. It wasn't cold, it wasn't pain, it was nullification, the absolute negation of choice. But Halden stepped forward. She had never been a creature of order, not even of hope. She was defiance hardened into motion. She placed her hand on the silent sphere. And it fractured. Not exploded. Not cracked. Fractured. Like a rule being challenged. Across the galaxy, things began to shift. Ships lost in the silent stretches of space suddenly found themselves back in known lanes. Systems long thought extinguished flickered with comms traffic. The choir screamed not in pain but in confusion. Because the source of their power, the finality they had always drawn upon, was now changing. And it was changing because someone touched it and refused to let go. At Nexus V, alarms lit the skies. The Lancer systems began to melt, fold, rebuild, decks reshaped, gravity wells inverted. Its AI no longer sang, it spoke. A voice Halden's, not recorded, not projected. Spoken now. I found the boundary. Silent. And I tore it down. Then the stars burned again. All of them. For the first time since the choir had come, no system went dark, no signal failed, no anchor flickered. Entire species reported spontaneous visions, not of battle, not of the echoes, but of themselves triumphant, not perfect, not united, but alive. Hope did not return. Spite became something greater. It became resolve. The choir fractured. Some vanished into the void. Others changed, no longer consuming, but watching, listening, as if curious what might happen next in a universe no longer obedient to silence. And Halden and Lorne. They did not return. But pieces of them did. In every Echo fleet, one figure would emerge during disaster at the edge of collapse, a voice in an abandoned calm line, a shadow between jumps, a scarred hand pulling someone back from death. They called them the refused. And every species began training to produce them. Not heroes. Anchors. Beings who, through sheer refusal to fall, could hold back the dark, not alone but together, in units, in defiant phalanxes, in ships without names that still moved faster than causality. Esraelith resigned from the Vrarthal Doctrine Council. He took no title. He spent the rest of his life as a mentor on the orbital fringe academies, teaching non-humans how to fight like humans, not with strength, not with logic, but with the will to spit in the eye of inevitability. Juno Baird commanded the first interspecies armada. She led it not in conquest or defense, but in rebuilding, resurrecting the lost corners of the galaxy, reawakening the systems written off by centuries of bureaucratic indifference. The Vhecht returned not as enemies, but as servants of the pattern broken, pledging themselves to a new understanding of war. They too had learned to fear spite and now wished to wield it. And deep in the fractures between time and meaning, something new began to form. Not empire. Not accord. Something post-final. Something that understood entropy would always win, unless someone stood at the last gate and refused to step aside. Humanity had been born alone on a blue world spinning in the dark. It was small. It was violent. It was chaotic. And it should have been forgotten. But it was, because it did not climb to greatness through peace or enlightenment. It clawed upward through spite, a refusal to die quietly, a rejection of every verdict passed down by those who considered themselves above emotion, above suffering, above will. The galaxy remembered the moment the Null Choir asked, "Why do you not surrender?" And the answer rang out forever. Because we remember who we are when everything else forgets. The stars sang again. Not in order, not in harmony, but in the furious, broken rhythm of those who had every reason to fall and stood anyway.